we're ready to start. I apologize for the delays here. Delay was so long that my computer decided to help. Don't mind me, I'm just talking to myself. There we go.
People today are experiencing an identity crisis. They don't know who they are. Culture bombards them with all kinds of images about what a human being should be like. Every choices are difficult to make because there is no foundation to their identity, to who they are. Temptations are everywhere to define ourselves by our culture, a culture of death. And that is why no one is immune from this identity crisis. That's why you gather together on Sunday to worship. What God said in the past, in Holy Scripture, is at the center of our worship. God uses the words of the prophets and the apostles as the means for Christ coming to us in this present moment, today, right now. And God uses these same words to take us on a journey with Him through death and resurrection all the way to heaven. In Jesus Christ, yesterday and today are joined in forever. And earth and heaven come together in one place. That is why we call this journey we have taken together Liturgy, yesterday, today, and forever.
In looking at that video, it seemed like what he was mostly doing was summarizing what we had covered in the class. I would say going through what is the liturgy, where did it come from, the life of Jesus, kind of all of the pieces and parts of that. I think it was a pretty good summary for the most part of kind of the whole thing. Now, I have a couple points that I want to make, but before I go to that, do you have any questions, or was there anything in particular that kind of grabbed you in that video that you had questions about, or that you wanted to talk about some more? Let me start with that. You guys have all been lulled to sleep by the dulcet tones of Dr. Just. Quite along the way, I thought. Well, one of the things that I think he commented on and highlighted that we didn't, at least in my memory, that we didn't particularly talk about in the series was the whole cross, Jesus' body on the cross thing, and kind of the symbolism behind that. And I found that kind of interesting for a couple reasons. First of all, that kind of gets at the heart of one of the basic tensions that we have in the Christian faith, and one of the tensions that we have in kind of how our faith is expressed into the world. And that is, what do we do with art and images and things, whether they're two-dimensional like this or three-dimensional, that portray God, Jesus in particular. And why is it that there is one part of us that may be uncomfortable with that? I mean, that's kind of the first question or tension. Why is that there is just that part? The answer to that, at least part of the answer to that, is that was actually a big controversy at the time of the Reformation. So, appropriately, we talked about it here. You had, at the time of the Reformation, about 3 different groups that were all sort of, that were all looking at the Roman Catholic Church and struggling with different parts of it. Okay? Group 1 is the Lutherans, which, you know, we're getting to know fairly well. The second group is the Calvinists. John Calvin, Ulrich Zwingli, and most of the Reformed churches of today kind of follow in that tradition. And then the third group are called the Radical Reformers. And these were the groups that, among other things, wanted not only sort of spiritual or theological reformation, but wanted political revolution. So Ulrich Zwingli, who kind of fits in both of those camps, was killed on the battlefield, for example, in a rebellion. But in both of those groups, the Calvinists and the radical Reform, in both of those groups, they were what is called iconoclastic. There's your 57-cent word for the day. You knew one was coming. Iconoclastic means that they were opposed to any depictions of God or any kind of art. Really, virtually any kind of art at all. The most extreme versions of that you would find today would probably be Mennonite, Amish, although frankly that fits historically. A lot of Presbyterian churches, any kind of Reformed or Calvinist churches. If you go into these churches, some of them today have stained glass windows or crosses. Many of them don't. Now, if you go back east, which means what? Utah. You go back east, I mean really back east, and you get to where the country was founded, and look at some of these early congregational churches or something like that. You walk into these churches. One of the things that strikes you about these churches is that they are very stark. They are everything is painted white, and it is a box. And it is very, very plain. Maybe there is a plain cross. Sometimes there's not. If you were to go into a Mennonite or Amish church today, you would find that to be much the same. Well, why was it that they were so opposed to having physical depictions of Jesus or of the lives of the saints or anything? Well, it kind of came down to a tension that there was about the incarnation, about how God becomes man, and what that means today, now. What we're going to do in Bible class for the next couple of weeks is we're going to look at it being close to Christmas. We're going to look at kind of some of the main scripture passages that talk about the incarnation, Jesus becoming flesh. And we're going to kind of unpack that a little bit. But for the iconoclast, because God is a spirit, and because we have these Old Testament restrictions against making graven images, to make any kind of image at all was forbidden, basically. And so having images was a big deal. You might remember Do any of you remember the Luther movie? I know our youth group, or some of our youth, watched it last weekend. There's a big scene in the Luther movie set early 1520s when Luther is in the Wartburg Castle and he's furiously translating the New Testament into I was about to say English. That's not right. Into German. and while he is gone, another guy who's going to be a part of the Radical Reformation, named Andreas Karlstadt, comes in and goes into the churches in Wittenberg and tears down all of the vestments, all of the stained glass, takes all of the crosses down, and just eliminates all of it, destroys it all, and basically argues this is all popery. That's the word. Not popery like, the fun stuff that smells, but P-O-P-E-R-Y, Pope, of the Pope. And so he tore all of this stuff down. I know, popery, I'm sorry. On the argument that all of this is wrong, that this is all kind of images of things that and because God is spirit and God is up there, we shouldn't be making these images. Luther, when he got back from the Wartburg, was appalled by this and immediately reset all of this stuff up. And his basic argument was God became man, Jesus became flesh. If we aren't comfortable and willing to put flesh and blood on Jesus today, then what is all of this about in the first place? So that's called the iconoclastic controversy, or that's kind of what's behind that. I know I'm making us a long lecture here. I'm sorry. I've just got to do this setup here. Now, kind of over the last 500 years, really, we've had in the church these kind of different movements that have circled around in different ways. One that's very, I'll say, very artistic and very visual as well as auditory, which is where you're going to get stained glass and crosses and crucifixes and vestments and lots of colors and symbolism and all this stuff. And then the other that says spiritual means not physical. Stuff that you can't see it or experience it. Spiritual means it's in your head or in your heart. Okay? And that's been going on for 500 years, basically. Those two tensions. And the Lutheran Church is not immune to that tension. We have gone back and forth in that tension as well, not only here in the United States, but back in Germany. There was a movement called Pietism that really was opposed to the same thing, these physical forms, and also the rise of another movement called rationalism. Kind of looks at all of this and says, since none of this stuff actually happened, it's kind of dumb. I think that would be the theological term from them. And then today, in America, we are sort of constantly bombarded with all of these different traditions and backgrounds, oftentimes not even conscious that there are different traditions or backgrounds, and kind of where they come from or why they come from here. And so that's why when we think about these things, in my pastoral opinion, we come at it with a lot of background, but not necessarily a lot of knowledge on why I like or dislike or think something is appropriate or inappropriate. Now, that's my kind of original setup to that sort of question and my backup to what Dr. Todd said. Now I will open the doors to whatever questions we have. Andy.
Could the anti-part painting, statuary, crosses, he 16th century thinking probably went before that, so that's what we're talking about, revolution, related to basically Hebrew people who speak God's name, and also that if you make an image, it limits.
Right. Well, there are a couple things going there, and that's actually, and I should have mentioned this before, I'm sorry. The iconoclastic controversy was not from the Reformation. It was actually from the 8th century, and it had to do with Islam. The iconoclastic controversy was at a time when Islam was on the rise, and in Islam, any kind of image of anything real is categorically forbidden. Okay, so if you were to go into a mosque, or if you were to look at Muslim art, you're going to see geometric designs. That's all you're going to see is geometric designs. No depictions in any kind of certainly the worst thing for a Muslim is making a physical depiction of a person. And the worst person to make a physical depiction of is Muhammad. This is why, if you remember this, what was this, a year ago, year and a half ago?
Oh, yeah.
When this French political satirist made this image of Muhammad. The satirist paper is called Charlie Hebdo, I believe. And the Muslims go absolutely insane because you don't make images of Muhammad or Jesus or anybody, because God is a spirit, and you don't make physical representations. So that was kind of what was behind that recently. That's why I say this stuff is not just from 1,500 years ago. This is very much now, here and now issues. Then, to get back to Andy's kind of question or point, in that iconoclastic controversy, the church is having to interact with Islam, which is growing like crazy. And when Islam went to conquer an area, sometimes there was peaceful coexistence. Sometimes there wasn't peaceful coexistence. But one thing is for sure is that the Muslims were deeply offended by any kind of physical depictions of Jesus or of the saints or anybody else. So this big controversy happens in the church on whether or not we should have these depictions. Why? Because we don't want to offend our Muslim neighbors. But if we're not offending our Muslim neighbors because Jesus became man, then maybe we're not doing our job as Christians. So that's kind of a simplification of it. But the upshot of that was in the 7th, 8th, 9th century was that no, to make a depiction of Jesus on the cross, specifically, and icons, I mean those two-dimensional images, that was what that was dealing with most of all. But to make physical depictions is a sign of God becoming man. And we're not saying that a cross, like this, with a body on it, this is Jesus, in the sense of like an idol. And an idol, we're saying, you make an idol in order to contain the God, to restrict the God to this place. And this is meant to do exactly the opposite. That is to show God's presence in humanity. So that was kind of how that controversy ended up along the way. Larry and then Catherine.
I'm just trying to put the timeline together.
Yeah.
Isn't there prior to that an iconic war between Roman Catholics, which did not want any art in the church, versus the Orthodox Catholic Church in the Middle East?
Well, I wouldn't call the West the Roman Catholic Church, because that's a bit of an anachronism at this point. But there is an East and West. But the issue there is, how are we going to address this in the midst of Islam? I mean, that was the broader context. I mean, it's a Christian controversy. You're absolutely right. And a lot of those that were in favor of of icons and art and depictions and stuff were in the East, which interestingly enough was where the Muslims were. So they were the ones that were kind of on the front line saying, no, we need these because this is kind of the sign or the mark that shows that that we're Christians. And so you take these away, and that makes it that much harder for us to differentiate. I mean, again, this is really simplified, but you're absolutely right on the timeline. This is like 7th, 8th century. The big theologian involved with that was named John of Damascus. Catherine, and then Jean.
Okay, a couple questions on that. One, I totally get the concept of, I want to put a crucifix up there because I want to offend anyone who doesn't believe in Jesus. You know, I especially, you know, with having younger children, I like when kids walk into church and go, there's Jesus. You know, I've had that with kids who've gone in other churches where there's Jesus. But I know for some people, when they see a crucifix or a Christ on the cross, they say, but Jesus is risen. The whole story is he's risen, so why do we have him on the cross?
Right.
How do you work with that?
Good question. And that first off gets at the question of what does a cross symbolize? Any cross, not a crucifix. And the answer is, first off, historically, is that a cross is a symbol of the Roman practice of execution. That's what a cross symbolizes, whether there's a body on it or not. If you were to have a symbol for the resurrection, historically in the church, the symbol of the resurrection has been a baptismal shell, or something to do with baptism. Maybe you get, this is why we have flowers on Easter, because this is new life, this sort of thing. So I think a part of the challenge with that really does come down to, is an empty cross the sign that Jesus rose from the dead or not? I would argue no, that a cross is still a cross, whether there's a body on it or not. And the point of a cross is we preach Christ crucified. That's St. Paul. Whether there's a body on it or not. Now, so that's kind of some of that background, and I do think that a part of the tension that we as Lutheran Christians face, and this is very much a Western Christian challenge, is how do we depict the death of Jesus and the resurrection of Jesus, artistically, musically, kind of in all of these ways. I think that is a great question for us to wrestle with along the way. And a real death means a real resurrection. That's kind of the hand in hand that goes on there. Larry, I'm sorry, Jean had her hand up before.
Yeah, I don't know where I was taught this in an art class I took somewhere years ago in college, was that the crucifix definitely tells us that what Jesus did, he is our Savior.
Right. Right.
Yet that the empty cross is a symbol of the Easter promise. He is risen, he is
Sure.
not here.
Yep.
And it has nothing to do whether we allow an image or not in the church. It has everything to do with our talk about our faith. And I think both are good. I truly do. To me, the empty cross, every time I see it, it fills me with joy and reminds me, he is risen.
So when you look at a cross, you think Jesus is risen.
Yes.
Okay. A part of the challenge with this is you can't argue with experience, right? I mean, I can't say to you, no, you can't experience that. Because that's not how human beings work. The question, I believe, in thinking about these sort of things is, what are we teaching? How do we teach it? And what is going to be the benefit of doing something this way versus that way? That's what I'm getting at. And what I am saying, Gene, is that historically, I'm not question the experience. Historically, a cross is a sign of Jesus' death. Whether there's a body on it or not, that for 2,000 years, that's what a cross has always meant, is a sign of Jesus' death. An empty cross as a sign of Jesus' resurrection is a notion that's kind of popped up in the 20th century. And again, I obviously am not arguing with your experience or anybody else's experience. I'm just saying historically that's where it came from for what it meant. Andrea. Audrey. Where did I get Andrea? Sorry, Audrey.
So when you say, so for me, the cross is a sign of not only Jesus' death, but my sin.
Sure.
So is that safe to take that to that level?
I think that's a good question, and that gets at what is symbolism, and how does symbolism work, which is a great question, and I would argue an important one, because that gets at the question of why do we have stained glass, why do we have crosses, why do we have crucifixes, why do we have anything of any kind in church, and do we look at these things? They're kind of, and this is an important concept behind art. There are sort of two ways of teaching art. One is to have art be symbolic and to teach the symbolism of what the art means. Okay, that's kind of traditional Western art history. The other is to show the art and say, now how does that make you feel? So that the meaning becomes subjective and not objective. So we're going to talk about that more too. But this is what we're going to kind of wrestle with for a couple of weeks. Because I just want to think about and look at some of the scripture passages specifically that have to do with the incarnation and what it means for God to become man. So, and I do apologize if I have upset anyone by any words or things that I've done. That is obviously never mind. Let's close with that. The grace of our Lord Jesus Christ, the love of God, and the communion of the Holy Spirit be with you all. Amen. Yeah, very